with carbon that we can do. And if we are going to be doing some sort of even more innovation through a new generation of debt for climate and debt for nature swaps, how that could be linked, that is basically in the making. And I'm happy that the Egyptian Stock Exchange, with the African Economic Commission, with the Singapore Stock Exchange, with London Stock Exchange, are working hard to do that. And this is a call for partnerships. It's not just for one country, too. Everybody in this room who has an idea can really be partnering. We need more of that. Then I'll leave you with one puzzling challenge. You may have seen this kind of an attack on ESG finance. And we need really here, yes, we are not going to defend every transaction that is claiming it's ESG, environment, social, and governance friendly, because many of them are not friendly to anyone, and they are just doing bad greenwashing. But the solution to greenwashing, as I put it nicely, I think, challenging the Economist cover page, that ESG needs to be abolished, and we need to focus on only in one E, and that E needs to be emissions. So instead of environment, social, and governance, we just need to focus on emissions. That would be misleading. And that could be useful for some countries. I would say some of the advanced OECD countries that had managed to do great in human capital, in health, education, fighting poverty, getting gender equality, getting the rest of the SDGs, and perhaps their only problem in life is decarbonization and cutting emissions. That's great. I wish that my home country, Egypt, reached that stage. And in this case, I would say, forget about the rest of the SDGs, forget even about ESG. Let's all focus on ESG. But the common sense approach, keep the ESG alive and have a better metric, and let's do a better scrutiny on what is claimed to be ESG or not, what's claimed to be green or not. And I'm really looking forward for that committee led by former Minister McKenna of Canada, that was commissioned by the Secretary General, to have a new report on stock taking, not to be confused with the other stock taking exercise, on what went right and what went wrong in areas related to ESG, because there is a great potential for the private sector when they are aligned with ESG to solve many of our problems, not just on the E part called emissions, but the environment and climate at large, and the S and the G, because you need really transparency and good governance. Having said that, it's basically going back to basics. It's about, we don't have the luxury of saying we love more public finance than private finance. It's horses for courses. It's public and private, it's domestic and external, that had to be put within an integrated national financial framework. And it's good that I'm sitting next to my friend from the Undp. They have been doing lots of great work on technical assistance on the integrated national financial framework. You have that, you need to get the budget, you have the budget discipline, then you send the signals to the private sector for the likes of Citibank and others to do their magic in complementing and advancing the work in this area. So we need every penny, every cent mobilized, and all hands on deck, as they say. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mahmoud. And that slide was actually very important that you shared, and thank you for that speech that you gave us, the keynote. I want to move very quickly and just really segue, because you're a high-level champion, and Ms. Kanawendo, who happens to be the only woman on this panel, well, apart from me, of course. You're a special advisor for the high-level champions, and congratulations on this appointment. Your thoughts on how we now advance, just building on, because I want you to build on very quickly in 2 minutes to what Mahmoud has mentioned. And also, you come from a dryland country in Botswana, and really we're extremes here from the rainforest of the Congo all the way to Botswana. Over to you, please.
Thank you very much, and a very good afternoon to everybody. Thank you to the Gabon government for hosting us. It is very interesting to speak right after Mahmoud, because we've shared notes. So I was hoping everybody else would speak, and then I could copy off of them
we shared
instead.
Notes literally, because we are in the same team. That's fine. But she's smart. She will.
But nonetheless, well, one of the things that we have done with the UN champions, and I must reiterate that last beginning of this month, we hosted the Africa Regional Forum in order to deal with issues, the complaints that we get that there are no projects in Africa around climate action, and then the investors complain that there are no projects, and then the countries say we have projects, but there is no capital. So we created platform to deal specifically with that challenge and to help to mobilize and close this gap of $1.3 trillion that has been identified as a need for both adaptation and mitigation in the continent. And the whole idea behind it is, one, deal with issues that can help to de-risk investment in the continent. It's clear, mobilizing finance is not just speaking about aid. We have to separate issues between aid and climate finance, because climate finance can act as a catalytic factor towards development in the continent. And climate action in the continent, as Mahmoud has rightfully said, is all about development, mobilizing around SDGs and dealing with poverty that already exists. So it's very important that as we look at solutions, we think about how we create a multifaceted, multi-stakeholder approach that brings in non-state actors, particularly when it comes to financing. And what we have found is that at the very moment, NDCs do not create space for non-state actors. And this is a problem because only 30% of financing, climate finance, that is being used in the continent at the moment comes from private sector, which basically leaves such a big gap and untapped potential towards the needs that have been identified for both adaptation and mitigation. So it's important that there be a revision of the NDCs, one, to deal with the investable projects first, to create an aggregation of investable projects, and then secondly, to make sure that space has been created for the private sector to invest in this, and to communicate in a way that attracts investors to want to participate in this space. And secondly, there is a very big opportunity when it comes to creating resilience, building resilience in the continent, whether you are in a forest country or from a desert. Climate shock is guaranteed in one way or the other. And we have to start hedging these risks, and we have to start working towards de-risking. And one of the things that we're working with and working on a proposal with ARC is on how we can creatively use insurance to deal with matters of loss and damage. And to that effect, if I could just share with you some figures that we put together, is we have identified, one, Swiss Re says only about $219 billion worth of losses are covered in the continent at the moment per annum, while about $270 billion are not covered. So it brings a total to about $500 billion worth of losses that need to be covered per annum. But we anticipate that that figure is only a fraction of what is actually needed, and the need per annum can come up to about, the need by 2030 can come up to $30 billion. And if African countries and development partners can commit a total of $2 billion towards insurance and reinsurance, we would be able to effectively cover $30 billion worth of losses, and these wouldn't have to be financed directly from national budgets because we've been preemptive, we've thought carefully about the climate shocks that we're expecting to have, and most importantly, we could be able to respond quite quickly to the issues and reduce economic scarring. Because after all these issues, it's all about economic scarring, protecting livelihoods, and ensuring that we are able to build back better right after a climate shock. So we put these together, and we anticipate, the proposal is, if for insurance and reinsurance purposes, we start off with member states in Africa contributing 0% and development partners contributing 100%, it brings us to a premium of about $200 million per annum. But by 2030, the expectation is member states should be able to cover their own premiums to build a disaster risk fund, but also to build a disaster premium fund. So this is a more tangible example of innovation around covering loss and damage in the continent and securing livelihoods. Thanks.
No, thank you so much. We have a lot to discuss at COP27. Insurance is coming on, and also really deep diving in terms of what is pragmatic and what's practical. I want to move over to a city, because I think what the pandemic did was to really amplify how cities shift where we live, the very places where we live in. Over to you, Mr. Lao. You're the mayor of Lomé in Togo, and I would like to hear from you sort of some thoughts in terms of what's working for your city. Over to you in terms of climate finance.
Thank you so much. As said, I'm Kamala Jai Alao, mayor of Lomé Golf 3, and I have an honor to represent also the International Fund for Cities in Paris and the West African Union for Cities. I would like to go in French, as we are in French-speaking country as well.
I'm going to tackle the issues of climate adaptation and fundings at the level of cities from the perspective of someone who comes from a country like Togo. Togo, to precise things in their context, Togo is a country which suffers a lot when it comes to climate issues like coastal erosions. On our 56 kilometers of coast, we can have more than 2/3, 3/4, which is totally damaged by coastal erosion. But Togo is also a country which has priorities like satisfying its educative system, its health system, and recently there are many priorities like the context linked to security challenges. I'm saying so because it is important to understand in order to understand why our governments are not able to lay emphasis on climate issues, because the challenges are challenges which are elsewhere are much more urgent. So coming back to the issue on how we are tackling climate issues at the level of cities, I would like to say from the perspective of a mayor, it's something that we live every day and something that we are fighting every day. The main challenge of a mayor is the management of a city, is the health situation of a city, is the improvement of conditions, living conditions of cities. And these set aside the issues linked. This has to do with the issues of the environment. So, but to come back to an issue which is very important to mayors of Africa and globally is the absence of funding to tackle all these issues. And to tackle all these issues, there are no resources. But we have noticed that the main development is what we can do today, although there are adaptive policies of climate at the level of countries. But the most important thing starts by the local government. And when talking about the local government is the daily management. And you should bear in mind that at this local level, there are virtually no fundings. I always say that pertaining to the climate issue, when you consider the Green Fund, it's already very difficult for countries to benefit from the funding of the Green Fund. Then talking about local African government, I mean, it's very difficult. We should actually change things by proposing solutions which are innovative. We should propose solutions which are linked to, which are going to be able to better tackle the issue of development and that of climate. Today, all projects that we have to carry out, that we should carry out, should include a climate plan, should respect the climate norm. This is possible, and this can only improve the health and the living standards of our citizens. And we considered this issue, I mean, to go to your questions, we have taken this issue seriously at the regional level, and we launched the initiative with the African Development Bank to create a fund which is dedicated to cities. This fund is going to have as aim to find fundings for the climatic issues of cities. The fund is going to work to design projects of cities on a plan with their climate adaptation, which is going to be precise, and we are assisted by the World Fund of Cities in Paris, which proposes many innovative solutions in this light. So globally speaking, as far as in order to summarize the question of climate adaptation, and from the perspective of a mayor, the climate issue is very important. We should look solutions efficient and rapidly, especially solutions which are in line with the needs of cities and what people are enduring on a daily basis. So we should leave this climate plan, adaptation plan, but let's go straight to the essentials. And to go straight to the essentials, we need the funding. The small impact that we are making on the field in terms of funding, in terms of achievement, realization of projects which enable to improve or to better manage the carbon, if the carbon effect of cities has a direct impact on the population. So this could be done. So I'm actually making an advocacy for that. The question of cities should be taken into consideration, and we should take the good solutions. And I thank Gabon for organizing this good forum, which actually highlights more what the continent is doing in terms of climate adaptation. Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. Thank you, Mr. Lao. This is very, very necessary.
I really like your point, the development and climate nexus, which is a really complex conversation. I want to move over to Malawi. Mr. Eisenhower, Kaka. I saw some very disturbing pictures, you know, when the tropical storm hit Mozambique and the rains entering much of Malawi, and we saw those disasters. Your NDC and looking at climate finance, what does it actually mean also for recovery for a country? Over to you, as you journey towards COP27.
Well, thank you so much. I will begin by saying, whilst we are talking, planning, speaking, climate change is not waiting for anybody. This is a reality that must sink in all of us, and we are looking at the consequences, the results, the effects of climate change. And as it has been said before, whilst the whole of Africa has only contributed less than 4% of carbon emissions, they are bearing the brunt of climate change. And Malawi is the best example of that. We've suffered a number of cyclones, and as you might all be aware, yes, there are competing needs. Whilst we must be focusing on issues of adaptation and mitigation, you are talking about issues of development and things of that nature. Now, when the different cyclones hit Malawi, for example, all adaptation and mitigation initiatives were swept away. And as a government, we had to restart. We had to start all over again to look at these measures that as a government we're trying to put in place. So, for example, through the NDCs, Malawi has determined to reforest 4.5 million hectares of land. And when we were hit by Cyclone Idai, Cyclone Ana, Cyclone Gombe, we had floods that swept away infrastructure. Even when you talk about areas that had been replanted and things of that nature, we lost substantially. Now, when you talk about issues of accessing finance, I think we've talked about this at length. There are practical challenges. There are a few African countries that have accessed green climate financing, for example, because there are capacity gaps when it comes to putting up proposals to the financiers and things of that nature. I believe that if we are to win this war against climate change, like it was said, we don't need a one-size-fits-all approach to dealing with this. Let us accept that we are, as countries or as players in this fight against climate change, we are at different levels, and there are countries that need to build capacity in terms of accessing financing. I would give, for example, Tanzania. There is a portion of climate financing that they are accessing. They were helped in developing proposals that passed through the stages. And yet, there are so many countries in Africa that are finding it difficult to access. Now, you are talking about the demand side of these finances, but there are also practical challenges in that whilst we are talking of Paris Agreement and these COPs creating obligations on the rich countries, little is taking place when it comes to honoring these obligations. And this places a serious, serious challenge when it comes to the implementation of these mitigation and adaptation measures in as far as the fight against climate change is concerned. So yes, Malawi, I would say that is the best example when it comes to the effects of climate change. Right now, we are still trying to recover. I was just talking with him. We are trying to regain our lost energy because when the cyclone hit, it affected the electricity system and everything else. So these are practical things that we must address. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Mr. Mkaka. I want to move to Kenya as well because I'm kind of doing this thread on the countries. And Minister Lee, if you allow me, I think you're going to speak last again. And really just wrap the cherry on the cake. Mr. Tobiko, Kenya has been very instrumental within the East Africa community and really just sort of sharing thoughts and experiences around climate finance because most of your ecosystems are interconnected. I'd like your thoughts and really experiences, but also really from the NDC example that he gave in terms of what's working for you or what hasn't worked in terms of climate finance over.
Well, what it hasn't worked is, I think, the whole approach that we, just to follow up from my friend from Malawi, we're proceeding here as if it is business as usual. It is not. It's not an academic exercise. This is a matter of life and death. We are no longer talking about climate change. We are talking about a catastrophe, an emergency. Our people are dying, and they will continue to die. Kenya hasn't seen rain in the last 2 years. The projection, and that's actually true for the rest of most of other parts of Africa. People are starving. Even wildlife. And we continue in a debate that is turning almost philosophical, academic. Yeah, it's important. All the array of available options for mobilizing non-public finances, they are known. So no one is educating anyone about all these. We know, so why haven't they been deployed? But I think we are missing the point. There are 2 points I wish to make. I think there is a false narrative out there in the global north that the global south, developing countries, Africa and so on and so forth are doing little to combat the vagaries of climate crisis. They assume Africa is doing little. And that is why you hear this debate, oh, let's forget about, let's stop crying and complaining. Africa, Kenya is doing a lot within the limitations and capacities and resources. And I think the first thing is that the contribution by Africa that, as we all agree, science agrees, contributes the least, but bears the greatest, must be acknowledged and documented. We do that not because we have to please, but because we have no choice. And I think that is important. The second point, because this is not really sharing lessons and whatever, I'm sure you can find this in our website. The second point as we go to COP27 is COP26. In COP26, during the high-level segment, I think all of us were there or followed those proceedings. The massive announcements and pronouncements and pledges given by those who bear the greatest responsibility. up to now, including the $100 billion that has been outstanding since 2009. I think it is time that Africa, as we go to COP27, we go clear with one voice. And that voice is those who bear the responsibility, the greatest responsibility in terms of greenhouse emissions. And they are known. They know themselves. They have the means. It is a justice issue as much as it is an economic issue, but more importantly, it is a life and death issue. The G20 countries, the special needs for Africa, you know how it was mistreated? All of us were there in a most contemptuous and cavalier way. And I think as we go into COP27, the first thing that we need to get out of the way is to ensure that the agenda item of Africa, special needs and circumstances for Africa is recognized. Then we can move to, and that is not to say that we are not going to do our bit. We shall continue to do our bit. We must, as we have been doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Tobiko. Your point that it's a matter of life and death is a critical one. I just want to mention before I forget that the slide that Mahmoud shared, that you can find this on the ODI website and their portal on the 100 billion, the slide that you saw with the numbers on the delivery on that 100 billion that was committed. I want to come to you, Mr. Nganga. I don't know what your acronyms actually stand for, GEA app. Sounds like an app, but over to you to just really give us some of your thoughts in terms of what you've heard. How do we reposition around climate finance? Please, go ahead.
Thanks very much, and all protocol observed. Let me start by introducing GEAP. GEAP is Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet. This is large philanthropy coming together and saying, we have a role to play. We have a role to play in energy access, energy transition, and we want to use philanthropy to support driving achievements towards CO2 reduction, towards energy access, and towards job creation. The big philanthropies that have come together include IKEA Foundation, and I believe IKEA has been working very closely with Gabon as well as Bezos Earth Fund on the mitigation side of things. And the third philanthropy that has come together to form GEAP is Rockefeller Foundation. And as I mentioned, GEAP's work is to deliver on three priorities: energy access, CO2 reduction, and jobs. I'm very happy to have both the minister from Kenya and the minister from Malawi, because we are working closely with those countries, and they're showing tremendous leadership. And with philanthropic support, particularly around mitigation and adapting to the impacts of the cyclones, we'll be supporting Malawi with battery energy storage that will drive significant solar installation. In Kenya, we're working with the Ministry of Energy to drive a green economy agenda, where the country will take its over 90% renewable energy generation and hopefully turn it into leading industries. And I'm particularly proud of Kenya because I am a Kenyan. So around this topic, it's quite fascinating to listen to the conversation, because we're thinking along the same lines. But it's time to stop thinking and talking and time to start working. And I would say we all know the challenges we face. Youth, significant youth population. Africa will be significantly impacted by climate change. And among all these challenges, there's an enormous amount of us that don't have access to electricity. And it's expected that that will continue. Despite all the efforts we see, the trajectory points to more than 600 million Africans remaining unelectrified. Those are enormous challenges, but they could also be opportunities if we look at them differently. We believe that these can be opportunities to unlock the challenges that the continent faces through developing our renewable energy resources. We have significant untapped resources that we should develop. But those resources and that renewable energy should go towards driving green industry and positioning the continent as a green producer As other continents and other regions face carbon costs, carbon pricing, carbon tax, there's a significant opportunity for Africa to position itself as a green producer and therefore drive economic development. But to achieve this, we will need to do three things. One, we must develop our enormous talented youth. We need to create skills, we need to create jobs so that we develop these young people. Secondly, we must drive renewable energy generation. We all talk about potential. Kenya talks about 7,000 to 10,000 megawatts of geothermal. I just heard that Gabon has enormous hydro resources. Malawi equally has enormous hydro resources and lots of solar potential. But it's still in the ground. We need to turn it into electrons. And the third bit is we need to invest in these green industries. Once you generate the green electrons, use them to develop green industries that drive our economic development. But this will require money, and a gazillion of dollars of money. Where will that money come from? One of those opportunities is, again, something I'm very pleased to hear being discussed in this panel, which is carbon credits. Africa has a potential to earn over $50 billion a year in carbon credits based on existing methodologies, and an additional 20 if we develop fit-for-purpose methodologies. And not only will this drive revenues to the continent and help us develop our potential, it helps the world. We're no longer asking for help, we are helping the world reduce climate impact and reduce emissions. So we are both winning in this. It's a perfect win-win situation. In order to achieve this, African countries must come together to develop a consolidated voice. This consolidated voice will drive methodologies that are fit for purpose. For example, for those of you who are from Nigeria, you know that there is a diesel generator in every household. What if you could turn that into a solar generator? How do you develop the methodology for that and earn the carbon credits for it? Second, we must develop laws and regulations that support significant project development. Today, one of the biggest challenges towards tapping this opportunity is lack of pipeline, and that is driven in large part to ambiguity on laws, regulations, and methodologies towards developing those projects. We must also embrace new technologies, such as carbon capture, carbon sequestration. Again, I'll reference Kenya, which has significant geothermal potential, but that same geology provides an enormous opportunity to capture and sequester carbon and earn a premium on that. We must embrace those technologies. We must drive transparency. Carbon credit developers today, we all know about the special cook stoves and everything else, but how much of that money remains in the country? How much are the financial intermediaries earning in commissions? And why is it that only 10 to 20% of that money is remaining on the continent? We must drive transparency so that we secure a lot more of those resources for the continent. And finally, we must develop new carbon credit opportunities through developing methodologies and market initiatives. And that's one of the many pools of capital we can leverage. We at the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, working with SC for All and the leadership of the indomitable Damilola, have come together to develop initiative that will help bring this story together to drive the continent's carbon opportunity. I'm delighted to hear from Mahmoud and from Minister Lee that there is an initiative towards that direction, and I'm keen that we can all collaborate. Let's not work in silos. Let's work collaboratively to drive this opportunity towards financing our continent. Thank you.
Great. No, thank you so very much for that point. Youth. Let's invest and reinvest in the youth. Mr. Sullivan, I want to come to you, Citibank, in terms of what your experiences have been, and really also on the collaboration element. He also mentions issues of regulation, which are very curious, and would like to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. I might take a different direction from your question, because I think we've been avoiding a little bit of the elephant in the room when we talk about blended finance. You know, private capital markets are not just. They basically are driven by a risk and return dynamic and by a fiduciary duty. And as much as we want to think about impact investors and the ability for investors to think outside of returns, they're still very much driven by returns. So how do we address that? And really, we address it really through both looking at both risk and return. Now, a friend from Kenya, is totally right about the narrative. So first and foremost, Africa has to be much more aggressive in owning and expressing its narrative. Professor Lee White talked about why isn't Gabon and its shifting in the economy getting rewarded by cheaper money. It will, because credit ratings are getting much more inclusive of what's happening with sustainability, with the environment. But we're not there yet. So we still have to look at that risk. So we got to own the narrative, we got to talk about the narrative, we got to talk about the NDCs, we got to talk about the ability to adapt and mitigate. Investors are looking at those things, but we got to make it very clear and get that messaging out, both as a continent, but also as individual countries and projects. Secondly, data. Data is still a gap that we have on the continent, but we are closing it through digitalization. We also have a lot of data from the African Development Bank, who's been the longest lender in the continent. We need to get more of that data out into the public markets to truly assess the risk. So we need to do that, in concert. And secondly, we have to de-risk. And what we really mean by de-risking is, and a great example of this is the AFDB room to run in my mind. They basically took $1 billion portfolio of private sector loans. They basically put different risk loss tranches. So basically they tranched 22% or 220 million of that portfolio as a first loss. They combined basically their risk absorption with private sector risk absorption. And what they were able to achieve was 77% of a double B portfolio going into a single A, which released capital, increased their lending capacity. In the first panel, Mr. Topping talked about engineering. This is all about financial engineering. It's there. We can do that. But we have to work in concert together. If we look at the revenue side, carbon credits is all about that in my mind. It produces a revenue stream, whether that's at a project level or at portfolio level. So utilizing, monetizing those carbon credits can be revenue enhancing to attracting capital. We're also seeing outcome-driven type instruments. So we issued the Rhino bond, basically, which had investors giving the principal is guaranteed, but the return on that investment was only if they were successful in increasing the rhino population in South Africa. And that was to be paid by an NGO, not by South Africa itself. So we're seeing opportunities coming about how you can enhance that revenue. So, when we talk about blended finance, it is about engineering, but it's also about cooperation. It's about alignment. And, really it has to be about much more public sector money being leveraged to overcome some of the private sector objections as it pertains to risk and return. So it's critical that we set metrics, we set targets. So we know how much money is being deployed around climate finance by MDBs, DFIs, donors, different funds. We need to say a portion of that needs to be allocated to mobilize private sector, and we're going to measure that, and we're going to monitor it, and we're going to report people who are successful in doing that. So setting the metrics, setting the governance around MDBs. I think our friend from the UN today talked about the business model for MDBs not really being set for today's challenges. So we need to get some of the governance to change with that. And we also need about risk transferring. So what AFDB did with its portfolio. We don't need DFIs to sit on assets that are actually producing and generating sufficient returns. Get them into private sector hands. The track record's there, the data is there, and then you're freeing up new lending capacity, be it on a concessional basis or non-concessional basis. So, it's easy to throw out the word blended finance, but we have to think about how do we engineer these things, and how do we get the resources to be truly optimized with that? Sorry I didn't answer your question, but.
No, thank you very much. I was actually already lost by double Bs and double As and numbers, and this is where it also brings the complexity of the subject, and I know that UNDP has been working very hard to really unpack some of this in our recent and more latest strategy from UNDP, what he mentioned on digitalization, why that matters, working with MDBs in finance. Mr. James, can you just really tell us in terms of the state of the work that you've been doing in Gabon and the collaboration and cooperation before I hand over to Minister Lee? Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Musunda. Listen, I really want to hear what Professor Lee Wai wants to say. So, but I was impressed by Minister Tobiko and his call to action and his cry for truth to power. I mean, come on, this is an emergency. Let's stop talking and take action. This morning, President Ali Bongo Ondimba, he spoke about, and the rest of the panelists, they said, let's talk, more action. Implementation, implementation, action, action. You know, UNDP, we're big. We're a large UN development agency. It's got some good points, it's got some less good points. But it's present in 160 countries around the world. We can pull expertise from left, from right, and taking that call to action. What can we do? Let's focus on action. What has UNDP done? UNDP has done 3 things in the past 2 years, 2.5 years, 3 years, particularly. One is what we call the UNDP Climate Promise Initiative. And we have worked with over 120 countries, 44 of which are in sub-Saharan Africa, to develop their NDCs. Now, I think my sister Mogolo said, well, the problem is then you have these NDCs, and then you have these roadblocks because we don't have bankable or what did she say, investigatable projects to put in. And so we hit a roadblock. And then we have access to financing, which is double A's, and Peter, who's a banker, you know, is very facile with this language, but let's face it, Monsieur le Maire de Lomé, I mean, this passes me as a development actor. And so what we need to do is we need to bring these two together. And I think that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get there. At least UNDP is changing through its INFF, as Mahmoud mentioned, this Integrated National Financial Framework, where we're investigating, we're looking at economic models, we're seeing where the blockages are, and we're trying to develop solutions. We're trying also to develop PPPs, public-private partnerships. We're doing road shows with Citibank, with other financial institutions. We're trying to talk, the left hand talking to the right hand. Mr. Tobiko, you framed it as as an economic issue, but also a justice issue, and it's both, and probably several more. So let's stop talking and let's start innovating. Let's start thinking out of the box. We're not perfect, but we're in the game, and we want to advance. We want to help Gabon as much as possible take the next step. We want to help Kenya. We want to help Malawi. We want to help Lomé, Togo as well. So listen, we're all actors in this. I think UNDP as an institution is adapting. We're not perfect, but we're going to get there. Let me stop and close on a positive note. I think the young champion from Egypt, I was so impressed by her intervention this morning because it was optimistic. You know, the future is green, the future is young, and the future is not business as usual. So let's figure it out. Let's figure out amongst ourselves. We're quite intelligent around this room, and let's take that next step. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for that, Francis. I want to now hand over to, thank you. I just want to hand over to Minister Lee and just, you know, Mr. Lee White, if you can tell us your thoughts and what you've heard around here in terms of what, you know, around cities, around vulnerability, resilience, but also on James's last remark, on being hopeful. Over to you.
Feeling the pressure. Moi et le CS Tobico, nous sommes toujours d'accord. We always agree with each other. So if Kyriako has spoken, then I don't even need to speak. Some of you may have witnessed our double act in Glasgow. We were joined at the hip. Il a dit quelque chose.
He said something that is very important. He said that when we wanted to talk about the special conditions in Africa, in Glasgow, we were somehow looked down on. And what Peter said is that we must be even more aggressive when we talk about what's happening in Africa.
We fought for the special needs in Glasgow. And as Peter said, we have to be more aggressive about telling the story, but because even though we have special needs, in proportion, most African countries are doing more than most developed nations on climate change. Si on pense, sorry, I'm switching between languages. I probably shouldn't. Sorry to the translators. Peter a parlé d'un engineering financier.
So Peter talked about engineering. Sometimes we're a little bit naive, but surely industrialized countries and multilaterals must focus much more on how to promote investment and how to increase the level of grants. Grants have never developed Africa. We do not want grants. We want investment. So all the money you want to give us, make sure you invest in Africa. Make sure you put that money in investment with the banks in order to increase finance for the future of our continent. Not an investment in order to draw raw materials from African countries and manufacture cars in your countries, but capital that will make sure Africa will be developed, money that will help Africa fight against these emissions. So, as a conclusion, and I'll say it in English and French. Sometimes it's very difficult to translate. In French, we say, "Let's not beat about the bush."
When I tried to translate it, I wonder what they came up with. First, I had stop turning in circles, but then I thought, no, stop chasing our tail is probably the right translation. On parle, on parle, on parle, on tourne, on rond, on tourne, on.
We are talking so much. We need to find solutions. We need to find concrete solutions to go faster, because even though Gabon has the chance, the opportunity to have a lot of rain, our brothers in Kenya are dying in the northern part and in other countries in Africa, so we still have a lot to do.
Thank you very much, Minister Lee, for those thoughts, and thank you. Can we give the whole floor and those that have exited a big round of applause? This has been absolutely amazing. I do not want to stand in between you and your lunch, but absolutely brilliant conversations. And really, as we've heard from the final speaker, Minister Lee White, action, 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 and less talk. Over to you. Thank you so much, and enjoy your lunch. Bon appétit.